As the morning I found out my husband had drained every single dollar we'd saved for our home, 7 years of sacrifice of skipped vacations and cheap dinners and saying, not yet, maybe next year, was sitting across the breakfast table from me, scrolling his phone, humming to himself like a man without a single care in the world. Does that image, that one image of him sitting there, relaxed, untouchable, completely at peace, while my entire future had already been quietly incinerated back. That is what I think about when people ask me if I regret what I did to him later. 'Cause I don't. But let me start at the beginning because this story didn't begin with the Porsche. It began like most disasters do, with a series of small things I told myself didn't matter. His name is Daniel, Daniel Mercer. 6 feet tall, good jaw, the kind of easy confidence that fills room for he does. I met him at a mutual friend's rooftop birthday party in the summer of 2016, and I will be honest, I was charmed. He was funny and warm, and he asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which, at 26 years old and freshly out of a forgettable 2-year relationship, felt like an extraordinary quality in a man. We dated for 2 years. As we got married in October of 2018, at a small ceremony outside the city, my idea, my budget, my spreadsheet. That's the thing you need to understand about how our relationship worked from the very beginning. I was the planner, I was the saver. Because I was the one who knew exactly what our checking account balance was at any given moment, who set up the automatic transfers to savings every first of the month, who researched mortgage rates the way other people scroll social media. Because Daniel was the dreamer. That's what I called it, back when I thought it was charming. He had visions. He talked about the future with this enormous sweeping optimism that made you feel like you were on the edge of something great just by standing next to him. He'd say things like, when we get that house, we're going to gut the kitchen completely, put in one of those big marble islands, or I'm going to drive us to our first anniversary dinner in something that actually turns heads. Big, beautiful talk. I lapped it up. What I didn't see clearly enough back then was that Daniel's dreams always had a certain quality in common. They were always centered on him, on how he would look, on what people would think when they saw him. 'Cause the house wasn't about having a home. The car wasn't about getting somewhere. It was about the image. It was always, always about the image. The red flags were there. They always are. I'm going to tell you about them because I want you to understand. I wasn't naive. I wasn't stupid. I was optimistic. There is a difference, and it took me 7 years of marriage to learn it the hard way. The first red flag arrived in the spring of 2019, about 6 months after our wedding. Daniel came home one evening with a new watch on his wrist. Not a nice watch, an extravagant watch. A Tag Heuer Carrera in polished steel that retailed for just under $4,000. I noticed it immediately. It was impossible not to. It caught the kitchen light when he reached past me for the coffee, and my stomach did this small, sick drop before I'd even consciously processed what I was looking at. Is that new? I asked. As birthday gift to myself, he said, and he grinned at me, that wide, easy grin I'd fallen in love with, and he held his wrist out so I could admire it. Beautiful, right? It's an investment piece. I wanted to say, our savings account is not an investment piece, Daniel. I wanted to say, we both agreed that this year was about discipline. Instead, I smiled back at him and said, it's beautiful, because I had not yet understood that his charm was also his armor, and that my tendency to keep the peace was, in the long run, going to cost me everything. I checked the credit card statements later that night. He'd paid for it in cash from his personal spending account, an account I knew existed, but had never really scrutinized, because it was nothing technical as autonomy. There was nothing technically wrong. It wasn't our money, it was his, but $4,000, gone, on a watch, when we were supposed to be saving. I brought it up gently the next weekend. He waved it off. Babe, I work hard, I'm allowed to treat myself. You're always so tense about money. You need to trust that I know what I'm doing. I backed down. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself that the overall trajectory was still fine because I was still making my half of the transfers to the joint savings account every month, and as long as I could see the number growing, I felt safe. I should have looked harder. I should have looked at where his contributions were actually coming from. The second red flag was subtler, and looking back, it is the one that makes me feel the most like a fool. Around 2021, Daniel started working late. Not every night, nothing so obvious as that. maybe twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He worked in that industry, and the hours in that industry have always been unpredictable, so I didn't think much of it initially. He'd text me around 6 or 7 to say he was wrapping something up. He'd be home by 9, sometimes 10. I'd save him dinner. We'd sit together, and he'd be tired, but not distant. Still warm, still Daniel. But there were small things. His phone, which used to live face up on the kitchen counter, started living face down. As he'd started clearing his browser history, I didn't snoop. I noticed it only because he asked me once to look up something on his laptop, and I saw that the history was completely empty at 9 in the evening on a Tuesday. Who clears their browser history at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday unless they have a reason? I mentioned it once. Casually, he laughed and said he'd read an article about digital privacy and was trying to be more careful about data. He said it so smoothly, so easily, with such complete and utter calm that I almost believed it. Almost. Here is the thing about living with a talented charmer for several years. You start to develop a very finely calibrated sense of when the charm is being deployed as a tool versus when it's just who he is. As it's like learning to distinguish between a real smile and a posed one. After a while, the difference becomes unmistakable. As, and in that moment, standing in the kitchen, watching him laugh off my questions about his phone, something in my chest went very quiet and very still. I said nothing more, but I started paying attention differently. The third red flag was the savings account. By February of 2023, we had accumulated together a little over $347,000 in our joint savings account. We had been at this for nearly 5 years. The goal was $400,000, enough for a 20% down payment on the kind of property we'd talked about moving into, a 4-bedroom in a neighborhood with good schools, good bones, room for the we kept saying we'd start when things settle down. Daniel had started contributing less. I noticed this gradually, in increments small enough that I could always find a reasonable explanation. A bad quarter at work, the market being slow. Some unexpected expense, a car repair, a dental bill, a work conference he needed to cover out of pocket. I believed all of it, because the alternative, the thing I didn't allow myself to think directly, was too large and too terrifying to hold. What I did not know then, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that starting in early 2022, Daniel had begun quietly, systematically, moving money out of the joint savings account in small increments. It was not huge withdrawals that would trigger an alert. Transfers of $1,500 here, $2,200 there, sometimes less. As he'd learned from watching me, I think, from watching me manage our finances for years, exactly how to move within the thresholds that wouldn't flag anything unusual. He moved the money to a private account I didn't know existed, and from that account it went somewhere else entirely. I didn't know any of this yet. In February of 2023, I just noticed that the balance felt a little lower than I expected, and I told myself I'd miscalculated. I told myself it was fine. As we were so close, we were almost there. The fourth red flag was a woman named Cassandra. I didn't know her name at the time. I just knew her as the person whose contact in Daniel's phone was saved as C client. I saw it once when his phone buzzed on the couch between us while we were watching a movie, and the name lit up the screen for just a second before he reached over, too quickly, and flipped it over. "Who's C client?" I asked casually. "Cassandra Lynn," he said, eyes back on the screen. "She's listing a commercial property in the East Side District. Big deal. She's high maintenance. Must be an important client if she's texting you on a Saturday night." He laughed. "That's real estate, babe." And that was that. He had an answer for everything. He always had an answer for everything. It was one of the qualities that had made me fall in love with him, and it was one of the qualities that had allowed him to hollow out everything we had built together, while I stood right beside him and didn't see it coming. By the summer of 2023, I was 33 years old, 7 years into a marriage I still believed in, standing on the edge of everything I had worked for. I had a career I was proud of. I'm a senior financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm, a fact that Daniel loved to mention at dinner parties in a tone that walked the line between pride and condescension. I had a joint savings account that I trusted. I had a marriage I thought was imperfect but solid. What I did not have was the full picture. That came in September. And when it came all at once, the way these things always do, not in a slow, dignified unfolding, but in a single gut punch moment that reordered every memory I had of the past 3 years in an instant. The call I'm referring to came on a Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk. It was a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't pick up, but I did. And the woman on the other end of the line said 4 words that split my life clean in half. Are you Daniel Mercer's wife? Her voice was not angry, it wasn't vindictive. She sounded, if anything, profoundly tired. Like a woman who had also been lied to, who had also just had the floor fall out from under her, and who had decided that the only forward was to make one very uncomfortable phone call. Yes, I said I am. My name is Lydia, she said. I think we need to talk. I closed my office door. I sat back down in my chair. Outside my window, the city went about its ordinary Thursday afternoon business, and I sat very still and I listened to Lydia tell me about my husband's girlfriend, about the apartment he was paying for, about the woman he'd been seeing for 18 months, about the conversations Lydia had overheard, because Lydia, as it turned out, was Cassandra's neighbor, and Cassandra, as it turned out, had a habit of having very loud phone calls in the building hallway. She said he was buying her a car, Lydia told me, a Porsche. She said he'd already handled it, that it was all taken care of, and she wouldn't have to worry about anything. As I remember the moment my professional brain, the part of me that manages risk and analyzes financial instruments for a living, clicked on with a strange, cold clarity. Did she say anything else? I asked. Anything about how he was paying for it? Lydia paused. She said it was coming from your house fund, she said quietly. She thought it was funny, she laughed about it. I thanked Lydia. I took down her number. I told her she'd done the right thing by calling. I hung up the phone. And then I sat at my desk, perfectly still for a very long time. I did not cry. I was not ready to cry yet. Instead, I thought about the dash cam. I had installed a dash cam in my car 8 months ago, a Van True model with cloud sync capability, because I'd had a minor parking lot incident and decided I was done being at anyone's mercy in an insurance dispute ever again. Every trip it recorded went automatically to a cloud account under my email address. Daniel had borrowed my car twice in the past 3 months, once in June, once in August. He'd told me he was going to look at a property. He'd told me he needed it because his car was in the shop. I thought about the dash cam. I thought about where it might have taken him. I thought about the car purchase contract, because I was, and had always been, meticulous its paperwork. And when Daniel had mentioned months ago that he was looking into leasing something new, I had, as I always did, offered to help. He'd declined. But the financing research I'd done in both our names, the preliminary applications I'd submitted to three dealerships as a joint inquiry, those were still on file. I thought about all of this. And then, very slowly, very quietly, I began to think about what I was going to do next. I did not go home that night. I know that sounds strange. I know the instinct, when your world detonates, is to go somewhere familiar, to walk through a door you recognize and sit chair that knows the shape of you and try to reassemble the pieces somewhere safe. But I couldn't go home. Not yet. Not to that house, that shared space, that kitchen where he'd sat humming to himself. That very morning, while I poured coffee and thought about weekend plans, I had no idea, none at all, that my life had already been completely dismantled. Instead, I drove. I left the office parking garage at 6:15, merged into the slow bleed of rush hour traffic, and just drove. North. Mostly because North was away from our neighborhood, away from the street where Daniel would currently be doing whatever he did on a Thursday evening when he wasn't where he said he was. I drove until the city thinned out into suburbs, until the office towers shrank in my rearview mirror, until I found a gas station off the highway with a parking lot wide enough that I could pull into the far corner and sit in silence and think. The dashcam light blinked red on my windshield, recording, syncing. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled out my laptop. I keep it in my backseat, force of professional habit, connected to my phone's hotspot, and opened the cloud storage account, linked to my breath away. Not because of what it showed. Not because of what it showed. Because of what it confirmed. Let me back up a little first, because to understand the full looking at on that laptop screen in a gas station parking lot on a Thursday evening in September, you need to understand the kind of financial life Daniel and I had built, and more precisely, the kind of financial life I had built, and that he had simply moved through like a man who considered infrastructure beneath him. As I am a senior financial analyst, I say that not to brag, it is simply relevant context. I understand money the way a surgeon understands anatomy, with a kind of dispassionate structural clarity that sometimes makes people uncomfortable at dinner parties. I know how accounts work. I know how transfers work. Because I know how to read a statement and identify the shape of a pattern from three entries, the same way a doctor can look at three data points on a chart and see a diagnosis forming. As for 5 years, I had managed our joint finances the way I managed everything. Carefully, systematically, with full documentation. Every savings transfer was logged. Every major purchase was discussed. As every month I would sit down on the first Sunday and review our balances, both personal and joint, and update a shared spreadsheet that Daniels was supposed to review, but I was increasingly certain had never once opened. The joint home savings account had one shared debit card attached to it and one online banking login that we both technically had access to. I say technically because Daniel had never once logged in himself. He just trusted me to manage it. That was our arrangement, unspoken but consistent. I manage the money, he manages the vision. Because what I had failed to account for, and this is the part that is professionally humiliating, that I will never entirely forgive myself for, is that a joint account, by definition, allows either party to initiate withdrawals without notifying the other. There is no secondary authorization required. There is no flag. There is no alert unless you specifically set one up, and I had not set one up because I had never once in 7 years imagined that Daniel would steal from me. I set up the alert in the parking lot that Thursday night. Then I pulled up the full transaction history. The first out-of-place withdrawal I found was dated March 14th, 2022, and $800. Categorized as a generic merchant listed. I scrolled down, April 3rd, $2,400. April 28th, $1,100. May 2 withdrawals, $2,200, and $1,750. By the time I had scrolled through 6 months of statements, my hands had gone completely numb. He had taken, in total, over the course of approximately 18 months, $214,000 from our joint savings account. It was $214,000. I sat with that number for a while. I said it to myself several times, silently, the way you repeat a word until it stops meaning anything, trying to find the angle at which it would feel real. Because it didn't feel real. It felt like a number you'd find in someone else's story. The kind of story you read online and think, how did she not know? And now I was sitting inside that story, and the answer to that question, how did she not know, right, sitting in the transaction history, she didn't know because she trusted him. Because trust is not stupidity. Because when you build a life with another person, you are making a choice to extend your certainty to cover them too. And sometimes the people we extend that certainty to choose to exploit it. The account balance, which should have read somewhere between $340,000 and $370,000, read $132,488 planned. We close. Not enough. The drive home was quiet. I don't remember music quiet. I don't remember music playing. I don't remember the route. I remember pulling into our driveway just after 9 o'clock and sitting in the car for 3 full minutes, watching the warm rectangle of light in the living room window, and thinking, he is in there right now. Is comfortable, calm. He has been calm this whole time. I went inside. Daniel was on the couch, watching a game, a beer on the coffee table in front of him. He looked up when I came in and gave me the familiar half-smile. You're late, he said. It was not accusatory, casual. Long day, I said. You eat? I grabbed something. I went up C-stairs, changed out of my work clothes, came back down, and sat in the armchair across from him. I watched him watch the game for a while. He was completely relaxed. He laughed at something on screen. He reached for his beer. The watch, a new one I noticed, different from the Tag Heuer. A heavier dress watch I didn't recognize, caught the lamplight. I said absolutely nothing about any of it. That was the moment I made my decision. Not a hot, impulsive decision, not the kind that ends up with screaming and thrown objects and neighbors calling the police, and everyone losing everything in the chaos. A cold decision. A clear-eyed, completely deliberate choice to close the doors inside myself, to seal off the part that was devastated and furious and betrayed, and to step back behind the glass of my professional mind and start thinking. I had found $214,000 missing from our savings. I had received a call from a woman named Lydia telling, and me, my husband had been having at the 18-month affair, money that belonged into our future, with money belonged to our future. But I did not yet have the full picture, and I needed the full picture before I moved. I smiled at Daniel from across the room. Anything good on? I asked. Does. The full picture began assembling itself over the next 48 hours, and it was worse than I had imagined. It was also, in a way I did not yet fully appreciate, considerably better. As the dashcam footage from June 12th showed Daniel driving my car to a Porsche dealership on the east side of the city. As I recognized the dealership's signage, I had actually done preliminary financing research at that same dealership 8 months prior. As part of our ongoing exploration of leasing options, I had submitted a joint inquiry in both our names. The inquiry had included my income documentation, my credit score, my name on the application. Path of lease started fresh. Resistance, the one that was already open, the one that was already open, the one with my name on the door. I watched the dashcam footage 3 times. As the footage was limited to what it could capture, the exterior of the dealership, Daniel getting out of my car with a folder under his arm, the angle of the afternoon sun, the row of gleaming Porsches visible through the showroom glass. But it was time-stamped, it was geotagged, and it was most importantly automatically backed up to a cloud account registered to my email address, time-stamped and locked. The footage from August 9th was more revealing. This time, he drove to what I could identify by looking up the address later as a residential complex on the Northmont side. A newer building, the kind with a rooftop terrace and a concierge desk and parking bays with electric vehicle chargers. He was inside for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When he came back out, he was not alone. The woman with him was beautiful. I want to be honest about that. She was tall, probably late 20s, dark hair, the kind of effortless, put-together quality that suggests someone who has never once had to worry about anything as banal as a savings account. She laughed at something Daniel said as they crossed the parking lot, and she touched his arm, that casual, proprietary touch that you make with someone you believe belongs to you, and he leaned down and kissed her temple. Cassandra Lynn. As I recognized her from a LinkedIn profile I had found by searching through Daniel's email contacts the previous night, while he slept beside me, while I lay perfectly still and did not cry, while I planned. As here is where I need to tell you something that I think is important. As when you discover your husband is a thief and a liar and a cheat, when you discover it all at once in the compressed, catastrophic way that I discovered it, there is a very seductive impulse toward chaos, toward confrontation. As toward walking into the living room and throwing his beer across the room and screaming everything you know at his face, watching him go pale, watching him scramble. I felt that impulse. As I would be lying if I told you I didn't spend at least 20 minutes of that first night mentally scripting the confrontation, imagining his face when I told him I knew about Cassandra, about the money, about the Porsche. But here's the thing about confronting someone before you have everything you need. You lose the element of surprise, which is the most valuable thing you have. The moment he knew I knew, he would start protecting himself. He would move money. As he would delete records. As he would call a lawyer. His firm, I knew, had a relationship with one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the city, and he would start constructing a version of events that minimized his culpability and maximized my exposure. I was a financial analyst. I understood leverage. And right now the leverage was mine, but only for as long as he didn't know I had it. So instead of confronting him, I made an appointment. Not with a divorce lawyer. Not yet. First, I made an appointment with the Porsche dealership. The sales manager's name was Greg. I found him easily enough. He was listed on the dealership's website as a senior relationship manager, which is dealer speak for the person who handles the accounts that matter. I called him on a Friday morning from my car, parked 2 blocks from the office. I introduced myself using my full legal name. I told him I was following up on a vehicle purchase associated with my account and my husband's account, referencing the joint financing inquiry from 8 months prior. Greg was helpful and professional and completely unaware that he was about to detonate a grenade because he confirmed the vehicle, 2023 Porsche 911 Carrera S in Carrara white metallic, and $130,000 car. He confirmed the financing terms, and then in a pleasant customer service voice, he confirmed the registration. Yes, the vehicle is registered to. A pause while he's read the screen. Mr. Sarah Mercer. Is there something I can help you with regarding the registration? I felt the earth tilt. Miss Sarah Mercer. That is my name, Mercer. Not Cassandra Lynn, not Daniel Mercer, not a joint registration between husband and wife. The car, that $130,000 Porsche that my husband had purchased with money stolen from our shared savings account as a gift for his girlfriend, was registered in my name. Why? Because he had used my existing financing inquiry. As because my credit score was better than his. As because Cassandra presumably didn't want the car in her own name, or didn't qualify, or because Daniel, in his arrogant, careless, clever but not quite clever enough way, had simply taken the path of least administrative resistance after that was spent, without thinking through what it meant. As what it meant was that the car was mine. Legally, on paper, in the eyes of the DMV and the dealership, and anyone who pulled the registration, the 2023 Porsche 911 Carrera S, currently parked in Cassandra Lynn's building garage, was my vehicle. As I thanked Greg, I told him I had the information I needed. I hung up. Then I sat in my car, and for the first and only time in those 2 days, I laughed. It was a real laugh, involuntary and sharp, the kind that bursts out of you when something so absurd happens that your body doesn't know how else to process it. He had stolen my future. Because he had hollowed out 7 years of savings, deceived me in my own home, conducted an 18-month affair with a woman he was buying a luxury sport car for, and in doing so, he had registered a $130,000 asset in my name. As he had handed me the weapon, he just didn't know it yet. I stopped laughing. I opened my contacts and scrolled to the name of the best divorce attorney in the city, a woman I'd looked up 3 nights before and already researched thoroughly. Her name was Margaret Calloway. She had a 94% success rate in high-asset divorce cases. She was known professionally for a quality that her clients called surgical and her opponents called terrifying. I called her office and booked the first available appointment. Then I drove to work, smiled at my colleagues, sat through 2 meetings asking if he wanted chicken or pasta for dinner. He sent back a thumbs up emoji. I replied with a small red heart. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I listened to him breathe himself to sleep, steady, calm, completely untroubled, and I stared at the ceiling and felt for the first since Thursday afternoons something that wasn't grief or rage or nausea. I felt clarity. It arrived quietly, the way real clarity always does, not with a fanfare, but with a stillness. As a sense of everything becoming very precisely focused, the way a camera lens sharpens when you turn it just right and suddenly the subject snaps into perfect relief. I knew what I had. I knew what I needed. I knew what I was going to do. I was going to be patient. I was going to be methodical. I was going to gather every single piece of evidence which I gave to every financial report I had ever written. And and I was going to build a case so airtight, so devastating, so completely and ruthlessly documented that when the moment came, there would be nowhere for Daniel Mercer to hide. As he had spent 18 months dismantling my future, I was going to spend the next 90 days rebuilding it on top of him. Because Margaret Calloway's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the river that on clear days looked like something from an architectural magazine. Because her waiting room was quiet in the way that expensives of places tend to be quiet, not the absence, suppression of it, and the sense that everything difficult happened elsewhere, off stage, handled by people who knew what they were doing. Off stage, handled by people who knew what they were doing. As I arrived 12 minutes early, I sat with my laptop bag across my knees and my hands folded on top of it, and I breathed steadily the way I breathe before presenting to a board of directors. Focused, grounded, clinical. I was not there as a heartbroken wife. I was there as the senior financial analyst on a very complex case, and the case happened to be my own life. Margaret came out to get me herself. Because she was in her mid-50s, small and precise, with silver hair cut short, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades being the calmest person in rooms full of panicking ones. As she shook my hand firmly, looked at me directly, and did not offer me any version of, "I'm so sorry you're going through this." I appreciated that more than I can say. We sat down across from each other, And she opened a fresh legal pad and she said, "Tell me everything, in the order it happened, starting with the financial structure of your marriage. Leave nothing out." I told her everything. As I talked for 45 minutes without stopping. I told her about the joint savings account, about the pattern of withdrawals I'd found, about Lydia's phone call, about the dashcam footage, about my conversation with Greg at the Porsche dealership. As I laid it out in the order it occurred, with the dates and figures I'd already compiled into a document on my laptop, which I slid across the desk to her when I was done. Margaret read it in silence. She was one of those readers who shows nothing on her face, and I watched her move through 3 pages of detailed financial notes without a flicker of expression, only the small, methodical movements of someone processing information efficiently. Then she turned to the last page, where I'd typed up the registration detail from Greg, vehicle registered to Miss Sarah Mercer, and she paused. For the first time, one corner of her mouth moved. Just slightly. Just enough, Mims. Mercer, she said, setting the document down, "I want you to know that I have practiced family for 26 years, and I have not had a case walk into my office in quite some time that came preloaded with this level of documented ammunition." I said, "Is that good?" "That," said Margaret Calloway, "is very good." She explained what she meant over the next hour, and, as she talked, their true size and implication come into focus in a way that made the number on our savings account feel, paradoxically, slightly less catastrophic. As Daniel had not made one legal error, he had not made two. As he had made 3 separate, compounding errors, each one worse than the last. And together they did not just constitute marital bug, with professional precision called a textbook case of financial fraud against a marital estate. Marital estate. The first mistake was the withdrawals themselves. As in our state, marital assets, which include any funds accumulated in joint accounts during the course of a marriage, regardless of who contributed them, are subject to equitable distribution in a divorce. This means that in the event of a legal separation, a court must divide those assets fairly between both parties. Fairly does not always mean equally, but it does mean that both parties are entitled to an equitable share, and any dissipation of those assets, meaning any spending of marital funds in a way that does not benefit the marital estate, can be counted the dissipating spouse in the final settlement. As Daniel had withdrawn $214,000 and spent it on an extramarital affair and a luxury vehicle for his girlfriend. Under state law, that entire $214,000 could be classified as dissipation of marital assets, which meant that in the property division, I would be entitled to my fair share of the full original balance, not the depleted one. The $214,000 he had stolen effectively became a debt he owed me to be settled from his share of our marital estate. Margaret wrote a number on her legal pad and turned it to face me. It was larger than I expected. That's a conservative estimate of what you'd walk away with," she said, "assuming only the joint account dissipation and standard equitable distribution of remaining assets, and that's before we discuss the vehicle." The second mistake was the Porsche. When Daniel registered the vehicle in my name using my financing application, he had done something that he had absolutely not intended to do. He had made it my property. Not marital property, my property. It was personal, individual. Because the vehicle was registered solely in name, signed deemed purchases, or received any disclosure about the financing being drawn from our joint savings. It could be argued, and Margaret was very virtually argued, that the vehicle was acquired that the vehicle acquired through fraud against me, and was therefore subject to recovery as a personal asset. In plain English, Margaret said, he bought a $130,000 car with your money, registered it in your name, and gave it to someone else. You can take it back. I looked at her. I can take back the Porsche? You can take back the Porsche, she confirmed, with the kind of calm that comes from having said devastating things in calm voices for 26 years. I thought about Cassandra Senlin then standing in that parking lot, touching Daniel's arm, laughing. I thought about her driving that white Porsche through the city, easy and untouchable, burning through money that I had earned and saved and protected for 7 years. I thought about her not knowing, not having any reason to know, that the car she was driving was registered to the woman whose future she and Daniel had hollowed out together. "What's the third mistake?" I asked. As Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "The third mistake," she said, "is my personal favorite. Because to understand the third mistake, I need to tell you something about Daniel's professional life that I had always known but never thought to connect to anything larger. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. As specifically, he worked for a mid-sized brokerage called He was a senior acquisition specialist, the person who identifies and brokers the purchase of commercial properties on behalf of institutional clients. It was well-paying work. His base salary was around $175,000, with a bonus structure that could bring it to $220,000 or higher in a good year. I had always known that Daniel had a private financial account separate from our joint finances, as I had assumed it was a personal checking account where he kept his spending money, the kind of financial privacy that most extend each other as a matter of basic dignity. I had, as I have said, never scrutinized it. I respected the boundary. As Margaret handed me a sheet of paper. As on it was a legal summary of the financial discovery process in divorce proceedings, specifically the right of each party to request full financial disclosure from the other, including all accounts, assets, investments, and income sources for the prior 5 years. As once we file, we'll have subpoena power over his complete financial records. All of them, every account, personal or professional, every transaction, every source of income. "What am I looking for?" I asked. "That," she said, "is what I need to explain." She had, in the week since I had initially called her office to book the appointment, done some preliminary background research on Daniel, the kind of standard pre-consultation review she performed for all high-asset cases, as standard professional practice, public records, professional databases, the kind of searches that were completely legal and routine, and that I had not known to do myself. What she had found was a company, a limited liability company registered in Delaware, called MCG Consulting Solutions LLC. The company had been registered 14 months ago. His registered agent was a legal services firm, the kind you use when you want to keep a company's actual ownership at arm's length from public record. The company had no website, no listed employees, no public presence of any kind. The company's single identified member, however, listed in the Delaware incorporation documents, was Daniel Mercer. "He has a shell company," I said slowly. "He has a shell company," Margaret confirmed. "By itself is not necessarily problematic. Many professionals form LLCs for legitimate business reasons, consulting income, liability protection, tax efficiency. What makes this one interesting is the timing. As the company was registered 14 months ago, the first unusual withdrawal from our joint savings account was 17 months ago. A 3-month gap between when the withdrawals began and when the company was formed. As he was accumulating capital first, I said. My professional brain had arrived at the conclusion before Margaret finished the sentence. As he withdrew the money in increments small enough not to flag anything, built up a reserve in a private account, then used that reserve or some of it to capitalize the LLC. Margaret nodded. That's the hypothesis. As we won't know the full picture until we get into discovery, and can subpoena his private account records and the LLC's financials. But if the money trail supports what I think it supports, what we're looking at is not just dissipation of marital assets. We're looking at a deliberate, structured attempt to conceal marital assets in a business entity, which has a different name entirely. "What name?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Fraud," she said simply. "Marital asset fraud. It's a civil matter, but depending on what the LLC financials show, it could also if the company was used to receive income that wasn't properly reported." I sat with that for a moment. As if the LLC received income from Meridian, I said slowly, income that Daniel ran through the company instead of declaring as personal salary, it would look like the company was doing consulting work for his employer. Which, depending on how Meridian's contracts are structured, might also violate his employment agreement. Margaret looked at me with something close to professional admiration. "You're fast," she said. "I do this for a living," I said. "It's just with other people's money." I left Margaret's office 2 hours after I arrived. The afternoon had turned cold, and the river below the building glittered in weak autumn sunlight, and breathed in the sharp air and felt something that I will attempt to describe, though I'm not sure I have the right word for it. It wasn't triumph. It was too quiet for triumph. It wasn't relief exactly, though it had some of relief's qualities, the loosening of something held tightly for too long. It was closer to the feeling I get when I am working through a complex financial model, and the numbers, after hours of iteration, finally resolve into a pattern that is internally consistent, when the chaos becomes a system, as when the noise becomes signal. I had a lawyer, I had documented evidence, the withdrawal history, the dashcam footage, the dealership registration. I had an LLC to investigate, as I had a vehicle registered in my name that I had not authorized or received. I had a witness, Lydia, who was willing to provide a statement. And I had Daniel sitting somewhere across the city, completely unaware that any of this was in motion. As possibly sitting with Cassandra, in the apartment I now knew he was paying for, in a building I could identify from dashcam footage, comfortable and careless, and entirely certain that he had managed everything so cleverly that nothing would ever come apart. I took out my phone and texted him. "Long day, thinking of you. Bringing home that wine you like, want me to grab dinner too?" His reply came in 40 seconds. "Yes, please. You're the best. Love you." I put my phone back in my pocket and walked to my car. Behind me, in the glass of the building, I could see my own reflection for just a moment, a woman in a charcoal coat walking steadily forward, face composed, nothing visible in her expression. As she looked like a person going about her day. She looked unremarkable. She looked completely deliberately fine. That was exactly how I intended to look for the next 8 weeks. As I want to tell you about something that happened 3 days after my meeting with Margaret, because it is relevant. And because it illustrates better than anything else I could say just how completely Daniel had underestimated me, had underestimated, really, the nature of the person he had married. As he came home on a Tuesday evening in a good mood, that particular bright, expansive mood he got when something had gone well at work, or when he'd spent time with someone who made him feel exceptional. He brought flowers. Yellow tulips, my favorites, the kind he hadn't bought me in probably 2 years. He set them on the kitchen counter and kissed my cheek and said, "I've been thinking we should take a trip." Something spontaneous. "What do you think about Portugal?" I turned from the stove and looked at him. He was smiling that easy, generous smile. The flowers were bright on the counter. As he looked, in that moment, warm and playful and full of momentum. The man who had stood on a rooftop at a party and asked me questions and, actually listened to the answers. "Portugal sounds amazing," I said. "What made you think of that?" "I just feel like we need something. An adventure." He came and stood beside me at stove, put his hand on my back, looked at what I was cooking. "We've been in a rut, haven't we? I feel like I haven't been present enough lately. I want to fix that." I stirred the pan. "I'd love that," I said. "Let's plan it." We ate dinner together. We talked about Portugal, Lisbon, the coast, a vineyard someone at his office had recommended. As he poured wine and refilled my glass without being asked. As he was warm and attentive and genuinely good company, the way he could be when he chose to be. And I sat across from him, smiled, and asked questions and gave him nothing, absolutely nothing, that he could use. After dinner, I did the dishes. As he sat on the couch, I thought about what Margaret had told me. The most important thing you can do right now is maintain normal routine. Do not confront him. Do not let him know anything is different. Every day of normal routine is another day of evidence on your side. I dried the dishes. I folded the dish towel. I went and sat beside him on the couch. "Portugal in the spring?" I said. He put his arm around me. "Perfect," he said. As I leaned into him, and I looked at the television screen, and I thought about the 3 mistakes and the car registered in my name, and the 47 days remaining in the timeline Margaret and I had outlined. I signed. And I thought, spring is a very long way away, Daniel. As in those first weeks after my meeting with Margaret, I became a different kind of observer in my own home. I had always been attentive. I am, by nature, a noticer of things. But now I was attentive with purpose, with direction, with the specific task of documenting a pattern rather than simply experiencing it. I noticed that Daniel's phone habits had evolved. He had stopped leaving it on the counter entirely. It was always in his pocket or face down on surfaces just beyond my casual line of sight. As he had taken to showering immediately when he came home some evenings, before we had dinner, in a way he hadn't before. Small things. As things that, to a wife who was not paying careful, forensic attention, would blend into the background noise of a shared life and mean nothing. I noted each instance in a password-protected document on my personal laptop, time-stamped and dated, not because I needed to document his behavior patterns, because Mark's focus was financial, but because I am thorough by nature, and because the act of noting things calmly, systematically, without stay-behind commentary, helped me stay behind the glass. It helped me stay in the place I needed to be. I also, during this period, quietly transferred a portion of my personal salary, money that was mine, from my own income, earned before any divorce filing, into a personal account that Daniel had no access to and no knowledge of. As I was not hiding assets, I was protecting resources I was legally entitled to protect. There is a difference, and I knew it precisely. As Margaret had also, during this period, engaged a forensic accountant named Patrick, a quiet, intense man who had spent 15 years at the IRS before going into private practice, and who had, Margaret told me, was a particular talent for finding things that people have gone to significant trouble to hide. Patrick had begun reviewing Daniel's financial footprint, using the publicly available information Margaret had already gathered, and he was building a roadmap for what we expected to find once we had subpoena access to the private accounts in the LLC. His preliminary assessment, delivered via Margaret in a brief email I read twice and then deleted from my work inbox. The pattern of withdrawals shows clear, deliberate structuring. LLC financials will be the key. Expect offshore considerations if the money moved outside the account system. Offshore considerations. As I had not yet let myself think about that possibility, that some portion of the $214,000 might have moved outside the country into accounts that were harder to trace and harder to recover. I filed it away. I did not spiral. As I told myself, one thing at a time in the right order, with the right people in the right positions. That was the discipline the next chapter required. Pure, relentless, invisible discipline. And I had never been better at anything in my life. There is a particular kind of strength that nobody writes songs about. As not the loud kind, not the dramatic confrontation in the rain, not the screaming match that clears the air, not the moment where you flip the table and walk out the door and everyone watching pumps their fist because she finally did it. As those moments are real and sometimes necessary, but they are not the kind of strength I am talking about. I am talking about the strength it takes to make breakfast, to set the table and pour the coffee and ask how his meeting went and actually listen to the answer, to sit across from the man who stole your future and smile at his jokes, and say good night and sleep well and turn off the light. Is to perform the ordinary choreography of a shared life that the person across from you notices nothing, no stiffness, no hesitation, no hairline crack in the surface, while underneath, invisible, methodical, you are quietly building the case that will dismantle him completely. As that is the strength I am talking about. It is not glamorous, it does not feel powerful in the moment. As it feels, if I am being completely honest, like walking a tightrope across a very long drop, every single day, in the dark, while someone on the other end occasionally shakes the rope without knowing they're doing it. I walked that tightrope for 91 days. The first thing Margaret and I agreed on, in our second meeting, was timing. As filing too early was a risk, we needed the full financial discovery picture before we moved, because once we filed, Daniel would retain his own attorney and the information would stop flowing freely. As filing too late was also a risk, because every week that passed was another might, through carelessness or paranoia, or the intervention of someone who knew more than he thought, realize that something was wrong and begin moving assets. The target window was approximately 3 months. Enough time for Patrick to complete his forensic analysis using the preliminary data. Enough time to build the dashcam evidence portfolio properly. Enough time for Lydia to provide a formal witness statement. And, most importantly, enough time for one very specific event that Margaret had identified as the linchpin of our strategy: Daniel's company bonus disbursement. As every year, Meridian Commercial Group paid its senior associates their annual performance bonuses in December. Based on his previous years, Daniel's December bonus would be somewhere between $40,000 and $65,000. Under state marital property law, that bonus, earned during the course of the marriage, was a marital asset, which meant that if we timed our filing correctly, we could ensure it was included in the estate to be divided. As file in November before the bonus was disbursed, and we'd fight over whether it counted. As file on December 16th, the day after the bonus historically landed in his account based on 3 years of pay stubs I had retained in our household financial records. And the money was already in the marital estate, documented, traceable hours. December 16th, Margaret said. That's our date. I wrote it in my calendar in a nondescript abbreviation that would mean nothing to anyone who saw it. Dec 16 apt, 91 days away. I need to tell you about Patrick, because he deserves more than a passing mention. Patrick Huang was 51 years old, the son of Taiwanese immigrants, and he had the particular quality of someone the way other people find mysteries interesting, as puzzles with solutions that were always there if you looked correctly. As he had spent 15 years at the IRS before leaving to build a private forensic accounting practice that, by the time I met him, encountered 4 law firms and 2 state attorneys' offices among its regular clients. He was also the least dramatic person I have ever encountered. Where Margaret had a quality of contained intensity, Patrick had none of the theatrics. As he was careful and quiet and exact in the way of very precise instruments, and when he spoke it was in full sentences with complete thoughts, and he never said anything that wasn't grounded in something he could demonstrate. As I liked him immediately and immensely. We met in Margaret's conference room on a Saturday morning in early October, 3 weeks after my first meeting with her. Patrick had a laptop open and a series of printed documents spread across the table in a fan organized by date. As he had been working, he told me, with the publicly accessible financial and corporate records associated with Daniel's name, and he had found enough to confirm the hypothesis and establish a roadmap for the full discovery phase. The LLC is real and active, he said without preamble. MCG Consulting Solutions, registered Delaware. There's no public-facing activity, no listed employees, no filed tax returns for the first year of operation, which is slightly unusual but not automatically problematic, depending on the fiscal year election. More interesting is this. As he turned a document to face me. It was a summary of corporate activity data derived from Delaware's Public Business Registry and cross-referenced with federal EIN records. The company has a business banking relationship with First Continental Bank, Patrick said. I can't access the account records without a subpoena, but the existence of the account is publicly associated with the EIN. What I can tell you is that the account was opened in the same week the LLC was formed, 14 months ago. Can you tell how much is in it? I asked. Not yet, but I can make an educated projection. He moved to the next document. Based on the withdrawal pattern from your joint account, and assuming a typical 12 to 18-month accumulation period before the LLC was capitalized, I'd estimate somewhere between $80,000 and a Guat 20 ASI account was moved into the LLC account at formation. The remaining balance of the withdrawn funds, the portion not in the LLC, most likely went to operational expenses, the girlfriend's apartment, the vehicle financing, day-to-day costs of maintaining a double life. I absorbed this. The LLC is where he's hiding the capital reserves. That's the hypothesis. The LLC gives him a financial identity separate from the marriage, a place where money can accumulate or be received that doesn't show on his personal financial disclosures. Depending on what he's doing with the company, it could also be where he's routing some of his meridian income to reduce his apparent personal earnings. That would serve 2 purposes: make his income look lower than it is, which affects alimony calculations in a potential divorce, and give him a legitimate-seeming business entity to hold assets under. Margaret leaned forward. If Meridian has been paying any portion of Daniel's compensation to the kind directly to him, consulting fees, that referral commissions, it likely violates his employment contract, which typically includes exclusivity and anti-competition clauses. And if he hasn't been declaring that LLC income properly on his personal returns, it's a matter for the IRS. So the LLC is both a hiding place and a liability, I said. Potentially a significant one, Patrick said. Which is why we need the subpoena. Once we file and discovery begins, we'll have access to everything. The bank account, The tax filings, the income records. If there's anything irregular, and I expect there will be, it will be visible. As he gathered his documents with the careful, precise movements of someone who treated paper the way others treat fragile objects. I want to be clear about something, he said, looking at me directly for the first time. I've done a lot of these. Financial fraud within a marriage is more common than most people think. Usually the dissipating spouse is sloppy, emotionally motivated people make mistakes, but occasionally you find someone who is methodical. In those cases, the evidence is harder to surface and takes longer to fully document. He paused. Your husband is not particularly methodical. The LLC is a reasonable structure, but his execution is inconsistent. He didn't file the first year, which suggests he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. The car registration in your name is an amateur error. A careful person would have found another way. He's intelligent, but he's not careful. That makes our job considerably more straightforward. I thought about Daniel at the breakfast table. I thought about the ease in his face, the hum, the certainty. He never thought I'd look, I said. No, Patrick agreed. People rarely do. October passed in a rhythm that was, on its surface, entirely ordinary. I went to work. I came home. As I cooked dinner, I had always cooked more than Daniel, another domestic asymmetry I had spent years not allowing to bother me, and we ate together and talked and watched television and went to bed. On weekends, we went to the farmer's market and had brunch with friends, and on one occasion had Daniel's colleague and his wife over for dinner. And I was a perfect hostess, warm and engaged, and I refilled everyone's wine and laughed at the right dining room, could have looked at me. Not one person in that dining room could have looked at me and seen anything other than a woman who was solidly, comfortably at home in her life. As I met with Margaret every Thursday morning before work in her office, I had told Daniel that I'd joined an early morning yoga class. He had said that was great, that he was glad I was taking care of myself. Because in those Thursday meetings, the architecture of what was coming took shape with increasing precision. Margaret had engaged a private process server, someone who could execute service of divorce papers discreetly, at a location and time of our choosing, without advance warning. As she had drafted the initial complaint, which cited irreconcilable differences as the stated grounds, clean, uncomplicated, while the financial fraud claims were being developed in parallel as separate civil action. As the decision to keep the fraud claims separate was strategic. It meant that the divorced proceedings could advance on their own timeline, while the financial complete picture, and meant that Daniel's attorney simultaneous one would be fighting on two fronts simultaneously. As two fronts is significantly more expensive than one. Margaret noted, with the same calm she applied everything, and significantly more psychologically taxing for the opposing party. I also, during October, had a second conversation with Lydia. She had called to check in, a gesture I found genuinely touching, from someone who owed me nothing, and we met for coffee one afternoon near her office. She was a quiet, careful woman in her 40s, who worked as a nurse and lived next. The rent was unreasonable, and the building was self-maintained, until she overheard a series of very loud phone calls. To have any opinion, a series of very loud phone calls, to have any N about her neighbor's personal, scene life. As I want to be useful, she told me, over her coffee. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone, but what I heard, I couldn't just leave it. As I told her that what she was doing was already enormously useful, and that if she was willing, Margaret would like to take a formal statement from her. She agreed without hesitation. As Lydia's statement, as it turned out, covered 5 separate overheard phone conversations spanning a period of approximately 4 months. Conversations in which Cassandra had referenced Daniel by name, described the financial arrangement he had made for her apartment, discussed the Porsche purchase with considerable satisfaction, and in one conversation that Lydia had almost not mentioned because she wasn't sure it was relevant, mentioned that the thing with the company is almost sorted, and then everything comes from there. The thing with the company. When I relayed this to Patrick, he went still in the particular way he had when a piece of data confirmed something he already suspected. She knows about the LLC, he said. She knew before I did, I said. That establishes intent to conceal, Patrick said, making a note, which is useful. November arrived, and with it came the event that Margaret flagged mistake, the one that he made entirely of his own volition, without any push from me. simply because he was Daniel, because he had always moved through his own confidence. With that particular competence that mistakes luck for competence, at to failing boss luck for competence. He tried to buy a house. Not our house, not the home we had been saving for, a different house. As a house that I found out about on a Tuesday evening when I was reviewing our joint credit report, which I monitored monthly, as I had done for years, and discovered a recent hard inquiry from a mortgage lender I didn't recognize. As I looked up the lender, I looked up the date of the inquiry. I cross-referenced it with Daniel's calendar, which he kept on a shared Google Calendar that he had largely stopped updating but had never removed me from. On the date of the inquiry, he had a calendar entry marked, Property Review, Personal. I forward the credit inquiry to Margaret's email with a single line, He's trying to buy property. Her response arrived within the hour. This is excellent. Do not react. Let him proceed. We need to know the address. I was not sure how to find the address. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I remembered Daniel used the same email's address for everything. Personal, professional, financial. As one of the shared life conveniences he'd never bothered to change, because he had never imagined I would need to look. I did not access his email. That would have been illegal, and I was committed to doing everything exactly right. But I did that week open a conversation about mortgage pre-approval during dinner, framed as a conversation about our shared savings goal, about finally making a move on the property search we had been discussing for years. It was actually, Daniel said, a little too carefully. I've been thinking we should hold off a little longer. The market is still adjusting. I don't think it's quite the right time. Oh, I said. That's interesting, because I saw an inquiry on our credit report from a lender called Pinnacle Home Finance. Did you reach out to them about pre-approval, a beat? It's just the smallest beat, less than a second, in which I watched something move behind his eyes. But awareness, a quick recalibration. Oh, that, he said, that was a client thing, one of my buyers. I put in an inquiry on their behalf to check rates. Sometimes we do that for clients to speed up. That was nothing. It showed up on our joint report, I said, with a small frown, as if I were confused rather than watchful. Is that normal? It must have been a glitch. He chid subject. I let him. That night I made a note. Nov 4. DMs explained credit inquiry as client inquiry. False. Lender is residential, not commercial. As Meridian clients are all commercial. As. The following week, Patrick had obtained and legitimate mortgage application tracking services, the address associated with the Pinnacle Biensign and Quiet Finad inquiry, and Daniel's financial find sufficient. A 3-bedroom property in a quiet suburban neighborhood 22 miles from where we currently lived. A street with good schools, the kind of neighborhood you move to when you are planning a different future. He was house hunting. For Cassandra, with money that was in the LLC, with a mortgage application that, if it proceeded, would require financial disclosures that would contradict the disclosures he would be required to make in our divorce proceedings. He was, in other words, building his escape route. And in building it, he was creating a paper trail that led directly back to everything he had tried to hide. He's not careful, Patrick had said. He was not careful. By the end of November, the case file that Margaret and Patrick had assembled was formidable. It included the complete joint account withdrawal history, annotated and dated, with Patrick's expert analysis of the structured nature of the transfers. The dashcam footage authenticated and timestamped, showing 2 separate visits to the Porsche dealership and to Cassandra's building. The vehicle registration documentation from the dealership establishing that the Porsche was registered solely in my name. Lydia's formal signed statement covering 5 overheard phone conversations. The Pinnacle Home Finance mortgage inquiry and the associated property records. Then a preliminary analysis of the LLC MCG Consulting Solutions, including its registered structure, its bank relationship, and Patrick's professional assessment of the likely contents of the business account. As Margaret set it all on her conference table on the last Thursday of November and let me look at it. It filled a document case. Tabbed, organized, clear. It's the kind of document case you could set in front of a judge and watch them understand without a single word of explanation. We filed December 16th, Margaret said. December 16th, I confirmed. As between filing and his attorney receiving the complaint, we estimate 24 to 36 hours. During that window, we will also be executing the vehicle recovery. The vehicle recovery. As I had asked about this process, and Margaret had explained it with her characteristic precision. Because the Porsche was registered in my name and I had not authorized its transfer to another person's possession, I had the legal right to recover it as my property. This was not a repossession. Repossession was what banks did. This was a recovery of personal property. As Margaret had engaged a licensed vehicle recovery service, the same firms that work with attorneys on asset recovery, and they would, on the morning of December 16th, locate the vehicle using the registered VIN and the residential address associated with Cassandra's building. And they would bring it to a secure impound facility pending the outcome of the proceedings. As she'll come outside and the car will be gone, I said. By approximately 7 in the morning, Margaret confirmed, before most people are awake. I thought about that image for a moment. The parking space. The absence where the white Porsche had been. Cassandra coming down to her car and finding nothing there. And Daniel, I asked. Daniel will receive some service of the divorce complaint at his office, Margaret said. For the process server to deliver it at 9:30 a.m. after his workday has begun in a professional setting. So he'll be at work when the car disappears, I said. He'll be at work when the car disappears, when the divorce papers arrive, when Cassandra calls him to tell him her car is gone, and when his HR department receives the inquiry letter our office will be sending about his employment contract and the LLC. I looked at her. The HR letter, I said. That's new. His employment contract almost certainly prohibits outside consulting arrangements with clients or client-adjacent entities without prior written disclosure. The LLC appears to violate that clause. His HR department has a legal obligation to investigate once they receive notice. We're not making accusations, we're simply asking a question. The investigation takes on its own momentum from there. She said it the way she said everything. Quietly, precisely, as if it were entirely ordinary to arrange for several separate catastrophes to arrive in a single person's life within the same 2-hour window on the same Tuesday morning. As I thought about Daniel at his desk, his phone ringing, the divorce papers landing on his desk from the process server, HR calling him to come down, Cassandra's name lighting up his phone screen. I thought about the morning I had found him at the breakfast table, humming. December 16th, I said again. December 16th, Margaret said. I drove home, I made dinner, I set the table. Daniel came home at 7, kissed my cheek, told me about his day. I listened to a word. As I woke up at 5:15 on the morning of December 16th without an alarm. I don't know why I expected to sleep. As I had gone to bed at 11, the same time I always did beside Daniel, who had fallen asleep within 8 minutes of his head hitting the pillow. I know because I lay in the dark and counted his breaths until they evened out. As he slept like he always slept, deeply, without interruption, the sleep of a man who had arranged the world around himself to his satisfaction and felt no reason to be troubled by it. I lay beside him for a long time after he fell asleep. I was not thinking, exactly, more like listening to the house. The particular quality of silence that a home has in the very early hours, when everything is still and the day hasn't started its machinery yet. Our bedroom, our curtains. The photograph on the dresser from our wedding, me and with his hand on my waist. Both of us laughing at something just off camera. 7 years ago. A different person's life. I got up quietly, went to the bathroom, looked at my face in the mirror for a moment. Ordinary face, no ceremony in it, nothing dramatic. I looked like a woman who was about to have a regular Tuesday. I went downstairs and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup and my phone and I waited. At 6:47, the text came from the number Margaret had given me. The vehicle recovery service confirmed. Assets secured. Location secure facility. Address to follow. The Porsche was gone. Somewhere across the city, in the parking bay electric of rooftop chargers, there was an empty space where a white 2023 Porsche 911 Annis had been sitting since roughly 3 anni 20, driven to there, handed over the keys to a woman and Cleana Gordena to a woman, who had Daniel had woman who had laughed about where the money came from. As I set my phone face down on the table, I drank my coffee. The house was quiet around me. At 7:30, Daniel came downstairs in his work clothes, charcoal suit, the silver tie he wore to important meetings. He was moving with the brisk energy of a man who had something good happening today. The Meridian bonus. He didn't know I knew about it, but I had watched him check his bank app twice the previous evening, with a particular focused attention that told me the disbursement was imminent. Morning, he said, opening the cabinet for his coffee mug. It was morning, I said. He poured his coffee, checked his phone. I watched his face in profile, whatever he was looking at, saw nothing alarming register, and sat down across from me. We talked about nothing, the weather. It was a work event he had on Thursday. Whether we should get a Christmas tree this weekend. This weekend works, I said. Great, I'll check online for the good farms. He stood, rinsed his mug. I'll probably be late tonight, year-end stuff. Of course, I said. I'll keep dinner. He kissed my cheek. He picked up his briefcase. He walked to the door, and I heard the door open, and I heard his footsteps on the front path, and I heard the Saint's car start nodding. And then I heard him for a moment after the sound of his engine had faded. Then I picked up my phone and texted Margaret. He just left. Her reply was immediate. Process server is in position. HR letter goes at 9 o'clock. I'll call you at 9:45. I put my phone in my pocket. I showered, dressed with care, not elaborately, just carefully. A gray blazer and dark trousers that I felt composed in. As I came back downstairs and washed my coffee cup and set it on the rack. Then I picked up my keys and drove to the office because I had a 9 o'clock meeting that I was absolutely going to attend, and I was going to be present and focused and professional because this was a Tuesday and I was a person who showed up to things on Tuesdays. And because I needed something to do with my hands until Margaret called. The 9 o'clock meeting was a quarterly portfolio review. I sat at the table and followed the presentation and asked two relevant questions and contributed accurately to a discussion about interest rate projections. And I am quite certain that no one in that room had any idea that 45 minutes earlier, a licensed vehicle recovery team had collected a $100,000 car from a parking garage on the north side of the city. And that at that precise moment, a process server named Kevin was walking through the front doors of Meridian Commercial Group's downtown office building. Kevin was, according to Margaret, a professional of some 30 years standing who had served papers on executives, sitting judges, and on one notable occasion, a state senator during a campaign event. He was, she told me, impossible to avoid or deflect, because he simply went about his task with the same quiet certainty with which a postal worker delivers a letter. Daniel was in his office on the 9th floor. Kevin confirmed with the receptionist that Daniel Mercer was present and in the building. He was shown to a waiting area. He waited 9 minutes. Then Daniel's assistant came out to ask if he had an appointment, and Kevin said he didn't, that he had a legal delivery for Mr. Mercer that required personal service, and after a brief back and forth, Daniel himself appeared in the doorway. I know all of this because Kevin writes detailed service reports as a matter of professional practice, and Margaret sent me his notes later that afternoon. Daniel, according to Kevin's report, looked at him with the calm confusion of someone who could not immediately place what was happening. He accepted the document envelope because Kevin extended it with a straightforwardness that made refusing it feel more awkward than taking it. He signed the service acknowledgement on Kevin's tablet because Kevin presented it as a formality with such routine confidence that Daniel signed before fully processing what he was signing. Then Kevin said, "You've been served with divorce proceedings in the matter of Mercer versus Mercer. Have a good day." And he left. My phone buzzed at 9:48. As I had stepped out of the quarterly review on the pretext of a client call, not entirely a lie. Margaret was a kind of client, and I was standing in the corridor outside the conference, looking at the straist on the windowsill, looking at the street 9 floors below. "How are you?" Margaret said when I answered. "I'm fine," I said, and I was, actually, calm and clear in the way that comes after very long preparation and the moment of commitment. "How did service go?" Kevin just confirmed. "As delivered at 9:32, signed and accepted. And HR?" "Letter was received at Meridian's HR department at 9:02. They will be required to acknowledge receipt and initiate an internal review. I expect they'll contact Daniel sometime today or tomorrow." "And the vehicle?" Secured at 6:47 this morning. The impound documentation is filed. It's registered to you and in your custody pending proceedings. I looked down at the street. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Ordinary morning. Has he called you? I asked. Not yet. He'll need to find an attorney first. But expect contact from opposing counsel within 24 to 48 hours. A brief pause.
Hmm.
You should know what comes next may not feel like what you're expecting. People react in very different ways when something like this hits. Some people shut down, some people come out swinging. I want you to be prepared for either. I know, I said. You've done everything right, she said. Every single step. What happens now is just process. I thanked her. As I went back into the meeting. I sat down and rejoined the discussion about interest rate projections, and I followed the rest of the presentation with complete attention, and at 11 o'clock I returned to my desk, and I waited. The first call came from Daniel at 11:22. I watched his name light my screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered. Hey, I said. Normal, warm. A little distracted the way I sounded when he called mid-morning on a workday. Silence on the other end. Not long, less than 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, I could hear the quality of his breathing change, the slight unevenness of a man who had been sitting with something for the past hour and a half, and who had not yet decided which angle to come at it from. I need you to come home, he said. His voice was controlled, tight at the edges but controlled. I'm in the middle of work, Daniel. What's going on? Something's happened. I need to talk to you. Can you come home? You're scaring me, I said, because I was allowed to say that, because it was a reasonable thing for a wife to say. I just need you to come home. I can be home by 6, Sarah. His voice cracked on my name just slightly. Please. I looked at my computer screen. Are you okay? Are you hurt? He didn't answer that. I'll be home by 4, he said. Please be there. He hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment, as my heart rate had elevated, not from fear or guilt, but from the particular adrenaline of something that has been in preparation for a long time and is now irrevocably in motion. The difference between standing at the edge of a diving board and being airborne. I texted Margaret. He called. Wants me home by 4. She replied, expected. Go. Stay calm. Let him speak first. Do not reveal the extent of what you know until he's made his choices about how to handle this. Call me after. I told my manager I had a family situation and left the office at 2. I arrived home at 3:15 to find Daniel's car already in the driveway. He was at the kitchen table when I came in. He was still in his work clothes, but the silver tie had been loosened and his jacket was draped over the chair behind him, and he was sitting with his forearms on the table and his phone face up in front of him, in a way that was completely unlike his usual composure. He looked, for the first time in 7 years of marriage, like a man who did not know what to do with himself. He looked up when I came in. Something moved across his face, an attempt at assembling an expression, at deciding what this moment required of him, and then, failing to settle on anything, he just looked at me with his face very open and said, I'm in trouble. As I set my bag down, I took off my coat, the same positions we'd been in 1,000 mornings, and I looked at him and said, tell me. And he did. Or rather, he told me a version of it. He told me that he had received legal papers at the office that morning. He said divorce proceedings, and he paused, as if the words themselves were physically difficult, as if saying them aloud made something real that he hadn't quite believed until this moment. He told me he didn't understand, that he didn't know how this had happened, that he needed me to tell him if I'd done this, if it was real, if there was something we could talk about. He did not mention Cassandra. He did not mention the savings account. He did not mention the LLC or the Porsche or the 14 months of structured theft from the home we had supposedly been building together. He told me a story about a wife who had initiated divorce proceedings, and he positioned himself inside that story as the confused and wounded party. I let him finish, as he was very good at this, at constructing a version of events in which he was the protagonist and the victim simultaneously. I had once found this quality captivating, as the storytelling ability of a man who genuinely believed his own narratives as he assembled them. Daniel, I said when he stopped, yeah, I know about Cassandra. The color left his face so completely and so immediately that it looked like something being switched off. Not a gradual drain, an immediate absence. As he went from the careful, contained performance of an injured husband to absolutely nothing all at once, as if the mechanism that operated the performance had simply stopped. He said nothing. I know about the 18 months, I said. I know about the apartment. I know about the Porsche. His jaw tightened. How? I know about the $214,000, Daniel. I know every withdrawal, every date, every amount. As I've had a forensic accountant review the complete history of our joint account since 2022. He blinked. That's the word. He blinked, the way someone does when they've been physically struck, a reflexive shutting and reopening of the eyes as if resetting the image might change what they're seeing. The forensic, he stopped. Swallowed. You hired a... I also know about MCG Consulting Solutions, I said. The LLC. The First Continental account. Patrick has been completely silent. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and stopped. Daniel stared at me, and I watched something work its way through his expression in stages, then eye calculation, then a flicker of something that might have been the beginning of anger, and then, underneath all of it, something I had never seen on his face before, in 7 years of marriage. Fear. Sarah, and the Porsche is gone, I said. It was collected from 647 this morning. It's registered in my name. It's in an impound facility now pending the legal proceedings. He pushed back from the table so fast his chair scraped the floor. You took her car? I recovered my vehicle, I said. My name is on the registration, Daniel. It's my vehicle. You registered it in my name. He stood up and walked to the kitchen window and stood with his back to me, both hands pressed flat on the counter. His shoulders were elevated, rigid. I watched the back of his neck and waited. I can explain, he started. Please don't, I said quietly. Not precisely. I have 3 months of documentation, 2 attorneys, a forensic accountant, and a signed witness statement. Whatever you're about to explain, I've already accounted for it. As he turned around, as his face was doing something I had never seen it do, cycling through expressions without landing on any of them, trying on anger and falling off it, trying on contrition and losing it, finding nothing that worked in the face of what I had laid in front of him. As he was, for the first time in our entire relationship, a man with all have you known that held together. Quiet now, the performance entirely gone. Since September, I said. He closed his eyes. 3 months, he said, more to himself than to me. You knew for 3 months. I needed time to do it right. He opened his eyes and looked at me and said, with something that might have been the most honest thing he had said to me in years, I didn't think you'd ever look. No, I said. That was your mistake. He called Cassandra 40 minutes later. I know this, because I was in the living room on the phone with Margaret, and I could hear him pacing in the upstairs hallway, his voice low and urgent and increasingly strained through the closed bedroom door. I couldn't make out all of it. I heard it's gone. The car is just gone. And then no, she had it recovered. It's in her name, I told you it was. And then an escalating quality to his voice that told me whatever was being said on the other end of the line was not calm. Then I heard him say, Cassandra, stop. Listen, and then clearly, through the door in the hallway, I heard him say, she knows about the LLC, a silence, and then his voice lower, I know, I'm handling it. Followed by a longer silence. And then Cassie, don't. He came downstairs 20 minutes later. He looked like a man who had just had a very difficult phone call, which was exactly what he was. She's angry, he said. As I looked up from the couch where I was sitting. I imagine she is, I said. He stood in the doorway between the living room and the hallway, one hand on the doorframe, looking at me with an expression I found impossible to interpret, in the way I had previously interpreted his expressions. All the old patterns were gone. The charm and the calculation and the warmth and the easy confidence, all of leaving behind someone I wasn't sure I recognized. Is there any way? He started. No, I said. You haven't heard what I... No, Daniel. He nodded slowly. He looked at the floor. He looked back at me. And then he said something that I will remember for the rest of my life, not because it was dramatic or devastating, but because it was so nakedly, simply true. I thought I was smarter than this. You're not unintelligent, I said. You just didn't think anyone was watching. He left the house that evening with a single bag. He called his attorney, the aggressive divorce lawyer his firm had a relationship with, the one I had anticipated. And I know this because the attorney's office called Margaret's line the following morning at 9 a.m. expectant, which was roughly 22 hours faster than Margaret had expected. As they want to negotiate, Margaret told me, and I could hear the quality of professional satisfaction in her voice that she was too composed to express overtly. His attorney is asking for an immediate settlement discussion. As, what does that mean? I asked. It means they've seen the complaint, they've seen the financial claims, and they've recognized that going to trial with this evidence is not in their client's interest. A brief pause. As it also likely means he received a call from HR yesterday afternoon. His attorney will have advised him about the employment contract exposure, so he wants to settle. He wants to make this stop being public, she said. As, which tells you everything you need to know about where we stand. The following days unfolded with a momentum I had prepared for, but still found somewhat breathtaking to witness. Cassandra, it emerged, had retained her own attorney, a separate action, entirely her own, because she was now in the position of having had her vehicle recovered, her financial arrangements disrupted, and her entire relationship exposed to legal proceedings, and she was furious. As, according to Margaret, who received intelligence on this through professional channels, Cassandra was directing considerable amounts of that fury at Daniel, because it was his errors, the name on the registry that had created account withdrawals, the LLC structure that had created the entire situation. As Cassandra's attorney contacted Margaret's office to clarify that Cassandra of Daniel's financial arrangements, and that she was prepared to cooperate with any investigative LLC if it meant clearly establishing thus, in the asset concealment scheme, that she had not been a knowing participant in the asset concealment scheme. As she was, in the assessment of both Margaret and Patrick, drawing a very clear line between herself and Daniel's legal exposure and preparing to step fully over it. She's going to testify, Patrick told me when this development reached us. If it goes to discovery, she's going to cooperate fully. Good, I said. It means the LLC investigation proceeds without opposition from anyone who might have stood in the way. Everything comes out. Everything, as it turned out, was more than I had fully anticipated. The LLC account, when the subpoena reached First Continental Bank, contained $94,000. A portion of those funds could be traced through Patrick's analysis to Meridian Consulting income that had been routed through the LLC rather than appearing on Dave's tax returns in apparent violation on Daniel's personal and punt returns, in apparent violation and his tax obligations. Patrick prepared a referral summary. It was addressed to two agencies. The first was the IRS. The second was the State Employment Licensing Board, which had jurisdiction over commercial real estate professionals. As Daniel's attorney, upon receiving Patrick's summary during the discovery process, called Margaret's office and asked, in notably less aggressive than his opening position, notably less aggressive than his occasion, whether there was a settlement number that would make the civil case go away. Margaret called me immediately after that conversation. He wants a number, she said. What's the number? I asked. I have a proposed figure, she said, and she told me what it was. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, a number that represented the fulls in dissipated marital assets, plus my equitable share of the remaining marital estate, plus the appraised value of the Porsche, which I had decided to sell rather than keep, because I had no value for abortion. And the money was considerably more useful, plus 2 years of projected lost savings growth, calculated at the market rate. As Margaret had also added at the bottom of the proposed settlement figure, a line item she had not discussed with me in advance. It read, spousal support 36 months. Daniel's attorney had 48 hours to respond. He responded in 31. The answer was yes. I was in Margaret's conference room when the signed settlement agreement came through on her computer. As Margaret printed it and set it on the table between us, and I read every line of it, which is my habit, a professional discipline that I will maintain until I die, because you should always read what you sign. It said what we had negotiated. The number was there. The terms were there. The provision that Daniel would make no public statements attributing the divorce to anything other than irreconcilable differences was there. Everything was there, clean and final and binding. As I signed where indicated, Margaret signed as my attorney of record. The document was transmitted to Daniel's attorney's office at 3:42 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon 9 days after December 16th. And just like that, not with a scream or a confrontation or a moment of cinematic satisfaction, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper in a sunlit conference room, it was over. I sat back in my chair. Margaret set her pen down. As outside the window, the river caught the afternoon light, gray-blue and steady, moving in its ordinary way toward wherever rivers go. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked. I thought about it genuinely. "Like the project is complete," I said. She smiled at that, a real one, not a professional one. "That might be the most accurate answer I've heard to that question," she said. I drove home. As not to our house, that would be sold as part of the settlement, the proceeds divided, but to the apartment I had rented 3 weeks prior, on a short-term lease, while the proceedings completed, a spare, clean space on the west side of the city. It was good light. A kitchen table just the right size for one person. I made dinner. I opened a bottle of wine that I had been saving, a good one, the kind I had stopped buying in the years when we were saving for the house, and I poured a glass and sat at my table in the good afternoon light, and I let myself feel, very fully, all of it. The whole 91 days, the grief and the rage and the discipline and the fear and the long patient work of it. I let it move through me and out the other side. Then I finished my wine and washed the glass and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 months, I slept the whole night through. Spring came quietly that year. Not dramatically, not with a single warm day that announced itself and changed everything, but the way spring actually comes, incrementally in degrees. The mornings getting lighter by a few minutes at a time. The air losing its edge. Does. The kind of change you notice only in retrospect, when you look up one afternoon in March and realize that the trees that were bare last week have the beginnings of something green in them, and you think, when did that happen? I noticed it from the window of my new house on a Saturday morning in late March. I was standing in the kitchen in the particular way you stand in a kitchen that is the breacher, light-reaching, still new to you. You're bodying for the fall relearning the geography of a space that belongs the sink. And I had a cup of coffee in my hands to you. And I had a cup of coffee in my hands. And the morning light was doing something remarkable through the east-facing window over the sink, and I thought, this is mine. The house was a 3-bedroom on a quiet street about 12 miles from where Daniel and I had lived together. It was not the 4-bedroom we had planned for. It was somewhat smaller, somewhat less grand, without the Marble Island kitchen Daniel had described in his sweeping future vision speeches. But it had good bones that I had always better quietly loved for its honesty, its suggestion that beauty that is only surface, and it a garden that the previous owners had clearly loved. And it had a garden in the afternoon, a quality of light through the rear windows that I had stood in during the viewing and thought, yes, as I had paid for it in cash. Let me tell you what happened after December 16th, because the story does not end with a signed settlement agreement, and the people who were standing on the wrong side of this situation did not simply walk away. As Daniel's professional life unraveled with a thoroughness that I had anticipated, but that was still, when it actually occurred, something to witness. As the HR investigation at Meridian Commercial Group, initiated by Margaret's inquiry letter, was completed in approximately 6 weeks. As its findings, which I never saw directly but which Margaret received through professional channel, were significant enough that Meridian chose not to share them publicly. Corporate entities rarely do, when the alternative is a quiet separation. Daniel was asked to resign. He resigned. The announcement was framed as a career transition, and anyone who didn't know better would have read it that way. The people who did know better were the partners who had authorized the investigation, the HR director who had overseen it, and the employment attorney Meridian retained to handle the separation agreement. And, of course, Margaret. Because he'll have a non-disclosure as part of his separation package, she told me. Meridian will want this quiet. He'll want it quiet. Everyone will keep it quiet, which is how these things work. And the IRS referral, I asked. Because those move on their own timeline, she said. Anywhere from several months to a couple of years. But Patrick's summary was thorough. If they choose to pursue it, they'll have a clear trail. The LLC income appears to have been underreported across 2 tax years. I thought about this. What does that mean for him? At minimum, back taxes and penalties, significant ones, given the amounts involved. As at maximum, depending on what an IRS assesses and whether they determine the underreporting was willful, it could involve criminal referral. I want to be clear, I can't predict what the IRS will do, but the referral is on file. She said this, in the same calm voice she used for everything, and I sat with it and felt neither satisfaction nor guilt about it. Only a kind of clear recognition that this was the arithmetic of the unexpected, that the choices down settlements lands of consequence, the territory that operated on the made had a weight that extended beyond my own laws and its own timeline, and nothing to do with me more, and had nothing to do with me anymore. It's out of our hands now, I said. Completely, Margaret confirmed. I found to my own moderate surprise that I was entirely at peace with that. I had not set out to destroy Daniel. I had not choreographed any of this with malice as my primary instrument. I had simply documented the truth with complete accuracy and submitted it to the appropriate people and institutions. And the consequences that followed were the natural result of what he had actually done, not of anything I had manufactured or exaggerated. There is a crucial difference between revenge and accountability, and I had been careful throughout those 91 days to stay on the right side of it. The marital house sold in February, 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. I was not present for the closing. There was no reason to be. The paperwork was managed through attorneys and the funds were distributed per the settlement terms. As I drove past it once about a week after the sale closed, purely by accident, I was on a different route than usual and turned onto our old street without thinking. And there it was, the house we had lived in together for 4 years. As there was a different car in the driveway. The front door, which we had painted a deep green the first autumn we were there, had been repainted cream. Some new family had already started making it their own. I slowed for just a moment, then drove on. As I felt nothing complicated about it, that surprised me a little. I had expected some residual grief, some nostalgic pull, but the house had never really felt like a home in the way I understand home now. As it had been a staging area for a future that Daniel had been systematically dismantling, even while I believed we were building it. As its rooms held mostly the memory of not seeing clearly, of extending trust to someone who was treating that trust as a resource to be exploited, and I found I had no desire to linger in those rooms even in memory. As the proceeds from the sale, combined with the settlement, gave me the number I needed. I spent 3 weeks looking at properties. I was methodical about it, spreadsheets, viewing schedules, a clear list of requirements versus preferences. I had a buyer's agent named Anna, who was brisk 14 and properties, before I walked into the house on the quiet street, with the good light, and the loved garden and said, "This one. You're sure?" Anna asked. She had shown me properties twice the size. "I'm sure," I said. The paperwork was straightforward. The closing was unremarkable. I got the keys on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, and I stood in the empty front hallway with the keys in my hand, and I looked at the light coming through the frosted glass panels beside the front door, casting a narrow rectangles on the wooden floor, and I thought, I built this. I saved this. This is mine in a way that nothing has ever quite been mine before. Then I went and bought a coffee table. I should tell you about Cassandra, because her part of the story matters too, and because I have thought about her more than might be expected. I never met her. I never wanted to. Because the dashcam footage, Lydia's statements, the legal proceedings, all of it gave me a picture of her that was detailed enough, and none of what I knew about her inclined me toward any strong personal feeling in either direction. Because she had been in a relationship with a man who lied to her about the nature of his marriage, in the same way he lied to me about the nature of everything. She had benefited from money that was stolen from me. She had laughed about it, according to Lydia. These facts existed, but she had also, when the situation collapsed, cooperated with the legal process rather than compounding the damage. Her attorney had been forthcoming, as she had made no effort to obscure Daniel's financial arrangements or protect him at her own expense. There is something to be said for that, even if the alternative, protecting him, would have been foolish. As what I knew, through the peripheral channels that these situations generate, was that by February, Cassandra was no longer in the North Side apartment. The lease, which had been in Daniel's name and paid from funds that were no longer available to him, had lapsed. As Whether she had left of her own accord or been effectively displaced by the financial collapse of Daniel's arrangements was not entirely clear, and I found that I did not particularly want to know. She was a young woman who had made choices that had consequences. So had Daniel, so had I. The difference was that I had made my choices with full information, and theirs had been built on the foundation of what they thought I didn't know. Because what I hoped for her, genuinely, was that she would reconsider the particular appeal of men who offer large things easily. That is not a moralizing wish, it is a practical one. It's the kind of man who has a secret second life and funds it with stolen savings and registers the gifts he gives his girlfriend in his wife's name is not a man who is offering anything real. Because he is a man who is offering a projection, and projections have a way of collapsing. I hope she landed somewhere solid. Because the piece of the aftermath that I was least prepared for was not the legal complexity or the financial adjustment, or even the loneliness, which was real but manageable. It was the conversation with myself that I had to have in the months after everything settled about the years I had spent not looking. This is the part I think people elide when they tell these stories. The revenge satisfies, as the settlement vindicates, the new life begins, and then, in the quiet of an ordinary Wednesday evening, you sit with the question of how you didn't see it sooner. And that question is not comfortable. I am a senior financial analyst, as I am trained professionally to identify patterns and anomalies in data. I spent 7 years with access to the financial records of my own marriage, and I missed or chose not to fully investigate the signals that were there. The watch, was the phone face down on the counter, the savings balance that felt slightly lower than I'd projected, the calendar entry marked property review, personal. I don't think the answer is that I was stupid. I don't think the answer is that I was naive. I think the answer is something more complicated and less comfortable. I didn't look because I didn't want to look, because what I might find on the other side of looking was a reality that I was not yet ready to inhabit. There is a kind of willful optimism that masquerades as trust, and I had been practicing it for years, and it cost me time and money and the specific, irreplaceable loss of 7 years of a life I had been pouring myself into. As I have sat with this without resolving it into a lesson, because life rarely tidies itself into lessons the way stories do. What I have arrived at instead is something simpler. I look now at everything. It's not from paranoia, not from cynicism, but from the understanding that clarity is a form of respect for myself, for others, for the actual nature of the situations I am in. I look because I owe it to myself to see things as they are, rather than as I hope they will be. That, I think, is the truest thing the whole experience taught me. And it did not require a Kermit-king confrontation or a dramatic moment of revelation. It required 91 days of very quiet attention. In April, I had lunch with Lydia. She had reached out after the proceedings concluded, a brief, careful text that said simply, "I've been thinking about how things went. I hope you're okay." There's no need to respond if you'd rather not, I responded. "Does." We met at a restaurant near her hospital on a Wednesday, and we sat across from each other in the way of true connection, a bond formed entirely in the context of someone else's disaster. Ian, and we talked for 2 hours. As she was quieter than I expected, from someone who had made a phone call that changed my life. She told me that she had gone back and forth about calling for 3 weeks before she did it, that she had told herself it wasn't her business, that she had convinced herself the calls she overheard might be misinterpreted, exaggerated, taken out of context, that she had only made the call because one morning she had been coming down the hall with her groceries, and Cassandra had been on the phone in the corridor again, and she had heard Cassandra say, in a bright, laughing voice, entirely without guilt, "She has no idea. She's so focused on her little spreadsheets, she'll never figure it out." "That's when I called," Lydia said. "When I heard that, because you deserved to know." As I looked at this quiet, careful nurse who had made a phone call she didn't owe me, who had sat across from Margaret and given a signed statement, who had done the right thing at some personal cost to her own comfort because she believed it was the right thing. "Thank you," I said. Not adequately, those words are never quite sincerely. "How are you?" she asked. "I bought a house," I said. She smiled. "A good one? Good bones," I said. "Good light, a garden someone loved before me." "Does. That sounds exactly right," she said. "I want to tell you about a specific morning because it is the image I return to most often when I think about where everything landed." It was a Saturday in late April, about 6 weeks after I moved into the house. I had been up since 7, which is my natural rhythm, and I had made coffee and taken it into the garden, where the ways I was only be plantings were coming back to life in ways only beginning to understand. Bulbs I hadn't known are pushing up through the soil, a climbing rose on the back fence, herbs along the plots that was suddenly full of tight, red buds that I had thought were dead and weren't. As I was sitting on the back step in the morning sun with my coffee and my phone, just present in the garden in the way you can be present when you are in a space that belongs to you and you have nowhere else to be. As my phone buzzed, it was a news alert, one of those local business roundup notifications I'd forgotten I had set up years ago, tracking commercial real estate activity in the city. The alert was about Meridian Commercial Group. As a brief item about a restructuring of their senior acquisition team. Daniel's name was not in it, of course it wasn't, he was gone. I swiped the notification away. I drank my coffee. The climbing rose on the back fence moved slightly in a small breeze, and the buds were very red against the old gray wood, and a bird I didn't know the name of was doing something energetic in the herb garden along the south wall. I thought, 7 years ago, I was at a rooftop party and a charming man me questions and listened to my answers, and I thought that was extraordinary. And it was, in its way. But what I understand now, what the whole long arc of the years between then and this garden has taught me, is that being listened to is not the same as being known. Being charmed is not the same as being chosen. And the life you build with someone who has never really seen you is not a foundation. It is a performance, and performances, no matter how well rehearsed, always eventually require a curtain. I had drawn the curtain. And here, on the other garden in April sunlight, mine entirely, and a cup of coffee, and a bird whose name I didn't know but was going to look up, and the particular clean satisfaction of a light that is exactly as large as axling in the background, without anyone making it smaller in the background. And as I finished my coffee, I went inside. I opened my laptop and started the morning's work. Outside in the garden, the rose moved in the breeze. The last thing I will tell you, because I to me at our final meeting, is something Margaret case file and shook hands when we closed the Claesbeim hands, and she wished me the clean, precise warmth of someone who does not overstay her professional role. As she said, most people, when they find out something like this, react in one of two ways. They either blow it up immediately, out of pain, and lose significant ground because of it, or they shut down entirely and do nothing out of fear and lose ground a different way. You did neither. You made a plan and you executed it. That is genuinely rare. I had good people helping me, I said. You did, she agreed. But the help only works if the person at the center holds steady. You held steady. I thought about that on the drive home. About steadiness, what it requires, what it costs, what it ultimately produces. About the 91 mornings of making breakfast and pouring coffee and saying good night and sleep well while underneath, invisible and methodical, the architecture of something real was being assembled from the wreckage of something false. It was not the life I had planned. It was not the outcome I would have chosen, back at a rooftop party in the summer of 2016, if someone had been able to show me the full map of where the next decade would go. But it was mine. Built correctly, on solid ground with clear eyes, good bones, good light, enough.